Scientific method, graphs, and data tables. Our learning goals are: describe each step in the scientific method and be able to define the terms purpose, hypothesis, experiment, data analysis, and conclusion, and to be able to construct a proper data table and an appropriate graph. All right, the scientific method is really just common steps that scientists use to gather data and answer questions about nature. Here are the 5 steps: purpose, hypothesis, experiment, data analysis, and conclusion. We'll go over each one individually. All right, the purpose is a question or problem that the experiment is designed to test. For an example, suppose I wondered, how can I grow more tomatoes in my garden? That might be a purpose for an experiment. Along with the purpose, then you have to do research and gather information or data in order to identify ways that you could investigate how to solve your problem or answer your question. So for example, I did research and I found out that tomato plants require a lot of water to produce tomatoes. So the next step after the purpose is called the hypothesis. And the hypothesis is a testable explanation for how to solve the problem or answer the question. A hypothesis is always in the form of if, then, and because. After the if, we make a statement about the IV, the independent variable. After the then part, we make a prediction about how the IV is going to affect the dV. And after the because, we give a scientific reason for why we believe the IV will affect the dV in the way we predicted. You can't say, because I think that's the way it works. That's not a scientific reason. So in my example, I believe that if I put more water on the tomato plants, that I'll get more tomatoes. So my hypothesis is if, now I'm going to talk about my IV, which I've decided is to put more water on one group of tomatoes than another. So I put if tomato plants receive more water, then I make a prediction about what will happen to the dV, which in this case the dependent variable is how many tomatoes I get. So my prediction is the tomato plants will produce more tomatoes, and then I give a scientific reason after because. And my scientific reason is tomato plants need lots of water to produce tomatoes. All right, so hit pause, answer these questions, and when you're ready, hit play. What is the purpose of an experiment? The purpose is a question or problem that you're trying to solve. Number 2, what is the proper form of the hypothesis? The hypothesis is always in the if, then, because form. The if, you talk about your IV. After the then, you make a prediction about how the IV will affect the dV. And after the because part, you give your scientific reason for believing the IV will affect the dV the way you predicted. All right, the third step is to run your experiment. And an experiment is just a scientific investigation designed to test the hypothesis. You change one variable and everything else is kept unchanged. That's a controlled experiment. When you do your experiment, at the end, you're going to collect data about the dependent variable, and data analysis is the 4th step. That's where you interpret the data collected from the experiment, and you're going to make charts and graphs and maybe even do statistical analysis. And finally, you're going to draw a conclusion. You're going to look at your data, and you're going to determine if the data supports the hypothesis or rejects it. If the data shows that your hypothesis was correct, then you support it. If it shows that your hypothesis was incorrect, then you reject it. We never say prove or disprove. We always say support or reject. So again, here are the 5 steps: purpose, hypothesis, experiment, data analysis, and conclusion. Now I put some pictures in here of people with different occupations. We have a military officer, a Supreme Court justice, a veterinarian, a car mechanic, an air conditioner repairman, a businesswoman, an MD, and a plumber. And you say, well, what do these people all have to do with the scientific method? Well, the scientific method is the most powerful way to solve problems that has ever been devised by man. And if you asked every one of these people how they go about solving a problem, they would describe to you the scientific method. Even though they didn't realize they were using it, they would use those same steps that we talked about to solve problems. Anybody who's good at solving problems uses the scientific method, whether they realize it or not. And let's look at an example. Here's a car repairman. Now, he uses the scientific method, but he doesn't call it that. That's just the way he goes about fixing cars. So suppose you take your car in because it's making a funny noise. Well, he's going to do a little research. He's going to listen to the car. He's going to talk to you. He's going to find out what's the car doing that's not right. And he's going to use his background knowledge to come up with a hypothesis. He's going to say the funny noise that you're hearing is due to the fan belt. And if I replace the fan belt, then the noise will go away. So then he's going to run his experiment. He's going to replace the fan belt. And then he's going to collect his data. He's going to listen to see if the noise goes away. And if it does, then he's going to support his hypothesis, and your problem is solved. All right, let's talk about graphs and data tables. Let's take an example. Let's say students wanted to know if they put some radish seeds in the dark and they put some in the sunlight, would the sunlight help or hurt the germination rate of the seeds? So they took one group of seeds and put them in the dark, and one group of seeds exposed to sunlight, and after 5 days, they count how many seeds germinate in each group. So that's their little experiment. Well, they're going to collect their data, and then they need to make a graph. So let's look at the rules for graphs. First rule is every graph should have a title, and it's going to be the same title as the experiment. And that title is always in the form, the effect of the IV on the DV. So in this particular experiment, our IV is light, so we're going to put the effect of light, and our DV is going to be how many seeds germinate, so we're going to put on the DV, which is germination of radish seeds. So here is our graph with our title. The next rule is that the dependent variable always goes on the y-axis, and you always include units. Now in our particular experiment, we're going to make a calculation and figure out the percentage. But here we have the DV on the y-axis, and instead of units, we're going to use percentage in this particular case. All right, the independent variable always goes on the x-axis and includes units. Now in this particular experiment, there are no units, so they're not included. But here are the two. The IV is light and no light. We have two groups. We have our experimental group and our control group. And we're going to do a bar graph in this case. So here's our completed graph. All right, so hit pause, answer these questions, and then hit play. What should the title of a graph be? The title of the graph is always the same title as the experiment, and it's always in the form of the effect of the IV on the dV. Which axis does the IV go on? The IV always goes on the x-axis. Which axis does the dV go on? The dV always goes on the y-axis. Alright, so let's talk about the different types of graphs that we might use. Bar graphs are used for comparing different amounts or different trials. Okay, if we want to compare amounts or trials, then we use a bar graph. So here's our bar graph. Here's our title, the effect of different types of scales on mass measurement of a standard weight. We automatically know what our IV and dV are from the title. The IV is going to be different types of scales, and our dV is the mass measurement of a standard weight. Right, here's our dV, and we have it on the y-axis, and we also have our units, in this case in grams. Here's our IV, it's on the x-axis, and because we have multiple trials, we're going to label each trial, trial 1, 2, and 3. We've included an average, but down here we've labeled the IV, which is type of scale. And over here, we've given a key so we can tell the different groups apart on our graph. All right, line graphs are appropriate for showing change over time. All right, so here's an experiment that was done to see the effect of different types of light on bean plant growth. So there's our title. Our IV is different types of light, and our dV is bean plant growth. Over here we have our dV, plant height in centimeters, and down here on the x-axis we have our IV, which is time, and we have our different groups, and over here we have a legend to help us tell them apart. Alright, so hit pause, answer these questions, and then hit play. What type of graph would you use to show a change over time? We always use a line graph for that. What type of graph would you use to compare two amounts, or two groups, or two trials? We would use a bar graph. Data tables are used to record the data from an experiment. And the rules for data tables are very similar to graphs. So here is a data table, and let's go through it. The first thing is we have our title, and it's the same title as the experiment. So once you figure out the title for your experiment, then you also have the title for your graph and your data table, because they should all be the same. And all of them are going to be in the form of the effect of the IV on the dV. In this case, our IV is the red light, and our dV is how high the plants grow. Below the title, we're going to have the IV and the dV. Below that, we're going to have our two groups. They'll be listed under the IV. So in this case, here is our control group and our experimental group. How do I know this is our experimental group? Because this group contains the IV, and the experimental group always contains the IV, so therefore I know this is my control group. Underneath the label for the dV, we're going to put our data. Notice I have units in here. If we wrote this plant height after 2 weeks in centimeters, then I could just list the numbers because I have the units up here. But if I don't put the units up here, and I have to put the units here. So there's our data with our units.